I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Daphne Miller today as our STEMspiration speaker. What intrigued me about Dr. Miller is that her approach to medicine is so closely tied to the earth and to farming. And farming and agriculture is such a big part of both our economy and our lifestyle here in Sonoma County. Restaurants highlight local organic farmers they work with on their menus, and farmers markets are plentiful. And there does seem to be a real local consciousness around the importance of where your food comes from, since we have the fortune to be able to access both meat and produce that's locally grown. That said, equitable access to that homegrown food is not necessarily a reality here yet. Dr. Miller studies the connections among health, culture, and agriculture with the goal of building a healthier and more resilient food system from the soil up. And today we're going to get to learn about her career pathway to becoming a doctor and how she's really created her life and career that brings all of her passions together. And so without further ado, here is Dr. Miller. Come on.
Hello, and thank you so much, Leslie, for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. Were you able to launch a little poll, or I guess there's only four of us in the room so far? Is that?
Yeah, I'm a little worried about if my links weren't working or something. So I want to say hello to Joe Ferguson. Let's wait. Let's just go ahead and get started.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah,
and then we
no,
can launch it.
I was pretty sure I was reading that right. So,
Yeah, I know.
okay.
Like,
But
where are the people?
no, and we'll get started and see if some other folks come in. And I have to say, it's actually really great that this is a very small crowd because I'm asked to give a lot of public talks, and I actually speak about my work a lot. But what Leslie was asking me to talk about was a little bit of my own trajectory and my personal path and what kind of brought me to this work. And that's not something I actually talk about very much at all. In fact, sitting down and thinking about what I was going to say this afternoon, it occurred to me that I actually had to do a little bit of thinking about exactly what were some of the themes and reasons that I followed a rather strange career path. And so let me actually, I put together a couple slides that I will share with you that I think could be helpful just to start the conversation. And so in thinking actually about one of the driving forces for me in my career, I'm thinking about this little kitten. And the fact that we do all enjoy watching little kittens so much. And they tend to be universally mesmerizing, and obviously they're adorable and little and fluffy. But one of the things about them that very much catches our attention is how curious they are and how much they like to explore, and how all these things in life that we kind of take for granted, from this little string that this one's exploring to blades of grass to grasshoppers, just seem amazing to them. And watching their delight and curiosity is something that is very compelling. And curiosity for us too is this incredibly valuable a trait or emotional state, which I guess sometimes we're not encouraged to develop enough. And I feel like I was very lucky from a very young age to have parents that encouraged me to be curious and to explore. And I also, thinking about, so what led to this strange career? I was the child of a career Peace Corps employee. He started off with my dad as a volunteer in Morocco, but then I grew up in Afghanistan and Tunisia, and went to local schools and traveled around the world with my parents. And it's a little different than traveling in the foreign service or the military, because you really are living very much more of a local life. And I was constantly an oddball, very, very different from all the kids around me because often I did not speak the language and I looked different. And I was from a completely different culture. And also because it was this very strange thing to be an American. And so everybody was curious about me, and felt, pretty free to ask me a lot of questions because that's what kids do. And I think having that experience from very young kind of gave me permission to be curious in return, both about different cultures and different environments and meeting different people and their experiences. So um, in sitting here and thinking about what has led me to rather eclectic and sort of circuitous path, both to medical school and working in agriculture and as a professor and as a science writer, it really, one of the driving forces has been the sense of curiosity and exploration. And the thing about the curiosity that I have held for many years is that it's been so strong that it's actually overpowered any sense that I have had that maybe I was certainly not the best or the most capable of doing the thing I was curious about. And it felt okay to me to show up and just be curious. And that often, the things that I did get involved in, I was the person in the room who knew the least about it. Somehow, was so curious and wanting to learn that that was okay. It's funny because in preparing for this, I went back to this little book that my mother made of poems that I wrote, when obviously I was barely literate, just learning how to write. And I realized that even these these little poems that I think it happened somewhere around age 4 or 5, were maybe a little older, 6, were ones where I was wondering, could a butterfly come out of a banana tree? I was very obsessed with bananas and I loved butterflies. And I was wondering if maybe they existed in banana trees. Sort of early ecology exploration, I guess. And in this other poem, I was really trying to figure out what it would be like to fly and what I'd see in the sky and all of the things, musings of a little tiny child, but that kind of curiosity. Fast forward a bunch of years, about 14 years from there, to here I am in college, and very different other kind of curiosity. This is the early 80s, 1983. And it was a moment where HIV and AIDS was starting to very much be a public health issue. And yet no one really knew what was going on. It was kind of like us in the first couple months of the coronavirus, where it was very hard to understand how it was transmitted and who was at risk. And I was starting on college campuses, and there was lots of fears around that. And by extension, a lot of fear about sexually transmitted infections in general. And I started to ask questions and be curious. And I went to the health services at my college to get some information. And I realized that there was like nothing there. And it was so weird to me. I mean, it wasn't like now where in high school or even elementary school, you get a lot of health education and sex education. There was really nothing. So we decided, this is my friend Laura and I, that we were actually going to start to launch a survey. It was access to computers or internet or anything like that. But we went to the post office and shoved surveys in all the students' boxes on what did they know about sexually transmitted infections? Had they had one? How were they treated? And then we went and found experts around the country for all, syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, and had them respond to the students' questions. And we published it, and little did I know at the time, but it actually became, the Brown University Press picked it up and it became an actual publication. called an actual book called STD Talk. We used to call them STDs back then, rather than STIs. But once again, it was curiosity that led to this experience that actually led to my first publication back then, that then became a resource. And then that curiosity actually led me to work for this was the article about us that was published in the newspaper. But that curiosity led me to work with an organization called Action for Boston Community Development that was a publicly funded organization that worked on improving access to housing and healthcare and everything for low-income families in Boston, and launching the first door-to-door AIDS education program for women of color in Boston who were being just the same now as COVID, were being disproportionately impacted by AIDS, HIV, and nobody was talking about it. There was a lot of discussion at that time about how it was affecting the gay community, but not communities of color. And we actually launched it as kind of, I don't know if anybody's heard of Tupperware parties, but kind of like door-to-door parties where people would host and, have food and give out pamphlets and information. And I kept this in my scrapbook because it was so exciting that as a result of our work, they actually created 2 job positions for people to do that work. So it felt like it was sort of, contributing to employment and so on. And, this all started because of a little interest that I'd had in college, around sexually transmitted infections and so on. Before going to medical school, I took a couple years off to actually do pre-med work because I hadn't prepared for medical school. In college, I hadn't done my pre-med requirements. And I was living in Chicago and actually working for a research lab, a job I got that I thought might help me go to medical school. And didn't really love working in the lab. One of my jobs was actually taking care of the research rats. I'm not a big lover. I love butterflies, but not rats. I guess that's not. And so I was really trying to look for other things that would grab me or that would sort of feel like passions in my week. And I started to, I lived actually near kind of a junkyard in Chicago, and not, great part of town. And I started to get really interested in all of the landfills around the country and all the trash and, and so on. And this was the late 80s, where we still weren't talking about a lot of environmental issues or recycling or things like that, especially in Chicago. And I wanted to start to raise awareness about this. And I was also just really curious, again, where does this trash go? What is the story behind it? And so on. So I started to collect it and actually make jewelry out of it that had little messages on it of sort of the story of that piece of junk and sort of where it came from and where it was going to go and what it was going to do to the environment. And sort of took this as an opportunity, once again, to follow my curiosity about trash and, these sort of environmental issues. And what that ended up leading to, and I don't know if you can see this on the screen, was actually a business where people were collecting my jewelry. It was called Ciclo, and a couple pieces of it made into the Chicago Art Gallery, and I was selling it. And this was a piece, there's an article about it that was in the art section of the Chicago Tribune. And you can see I made crazy like mirrors and hairbrushes and bracelets and so on with it. But once again, it was sort of curiosity that drove me on this arts exploration. it also helped me pay for my first year of medical school, which was very, very exciting because medical school was exceptionally expensive. And so that was a real benefit. Move forward to this is probably 4 years after that. I had made my way through medical school and come out the other end. And I was starting my internship, which is what doctors do once they've finished their medical school, to start their training in their specialty. And you're kind of halfway between a student and a real professional doctor at that point. And this is where you sort of define yourself, whether you're going to be a family doctor or if you're going into internal medicine or surgery or what have you. And I chose to go into family medicine, and I actually chose to do my training in a community hospital in California, in Salinas at the Natividad Medical Center. And this is a picture of me with one of the babies that I delivered on one of my first weeks of internship when I was still kind of naive and very optimistic. Well, the hospital itself is a really grueling place to work and was a very, very exhausting, overwhelming experience. But as I was spending time there, I started to get curious once again about all these health issues that I was seeing, because what I was realizing was that there was kind of a theme behind them. And that many of them seem to, in one way or another, connect back to where Salinas was located, which is, if you look at it here, it's in the middle of all of these agricultural fields. It is really literally in the lettuce basket of California. I know that Sonoma produces a lot of food too, but this area really pumps out, the strawberries and the artichokes and the asparagus and the lettuces for the whole country, and actually for the world, that goes around the world. And what I was starting to notice was that many of my patients were harmed by this agricultural system. They were either farm workers who had literally been injured or poisoned in the field, or they were ones who had been treated with unfair labor, or by unfair labor practices, or exploited or discriminated against. And I was also on the flip side seeing patients with diabetes and heart disease because they didn't have the funds to access the fruits and vegetables, even though oftentimes they were working to grow them. And so, I started to realize that kids were coming in with asthma, especially during plowing season and spraying season, and how much my patients were being harmed by the system. And I started to ask my medical professors, what is going on with this agricultural system, and how can we fix it to make it so it's more healthful, so it doesn't hurt us? And they kind of said, well, forget that, Miller, go back into the emergency room. This is really not your job to worry about agriculture. But it became this real source of interest, and felt like it was a very primary, issue that I needed to tackle. And I became, deeply curious about how I could begin to address these things. There was just very little crosstalk or conversation. And in fact, as Leslie said, this really has been kind of a launching point for my interests in ecology and farming systems and food systems and traditional foodways and issues around food sovereignty and using food to prevent chronic disease and so on. As I started to practice as a physician, I suddenly started hearing all these stories from patients who had heart disease or cancer or diabetes at an early age. Health issues that were definitely at least partially caused by their diet and certainly by their lifestyle. And hearing them tell me stories about how the mother or their grandmother who had lived to age 90 and hadn't gotten these diseases at all, and that they were the first person in their entire family to get diabetes, and the first person to have a heart attack. And it really started to make me realize that there was all this wisdom that they could learn from their ancestors, from their parents, their grandparents. And so I started to actually document some of these stories and also travel to places where my patients were from originally around the world, and tell the story about that, the food that was being grown there and so on. And that became, I guess, honestly, my second book. If you count STD Talk as my first book, for many, but the Jungle Effect was published by HarperCollins, and is still being used both as a textbook for nutrition courses, and it's also something that people use as a self-help book to get better, and so on. And that book allowed me to travel to such interesting places, and once again sort of grow my interest and curiosity, and meet families in Japan who were connected to patients I had in my practice in the US, and find out how they were eating, and travel and talk to nuns in Italy, in the mountains of Italy, and find out about this woman who was over 100 years old, find out about her diet, and so on. As I was doing this work, I suddenly got very curious of not just about the diets themselves, but more about agricultural production systems. And in some interesting ways, how the physiology of soil even related to the physiologies of our own bodies, in terms of the layers of the skin and the way the microbes worked, and the way nutrients were transferred, and just seeing how all of our systems were kind of not in parallel, but also interconnected. And also on a microbial level, realizing that microbes in our gut, which is what you're seeing over there on the left hand of the screen with the villi in our gut, as compared to microbes in the soil with the roots of plants, that those systems were very, very similar. And started to travel around the world again, visiting different kinds of agricultural systems. This is in eastern India, on the Bangladesh border, with Bibi Rane, who runs a cooperative there and does some beautiful ecological farming. And this is a biodynamic community in Sweden. It's just so once again, finding out about the connections between soil and our own health, and visiting lots of different places, and then starting to write about that. With things starting with my own gardening curiosity, and then moving out from there. And that culminated in another book called Pharmacology, that what innovative family farming can teach us about health and healing. And also not just in terms of the lessons there, but also the interconnections. This is an article that I published the other day on bacteriophage in the Washington Post. I just have continued to be curious, I guess, and not necessarily feel like I couldn't pursue a question simply because I didn't know anything about it. In fact, that could be a very good reason to call up people and learn, And so I really, COVID's made me very interested in viruses in general. And I was surprised to find out that most viruses are pretty friendly, and some are even life-saving. And so doing this piece was not meant in any way to diminish how terrible COVID is, but to have us understand the viral world a little bit better. And this just came out the other day. But I've published pieces in the past on what our pets can tell us about our own health. Their health can tell us about our own health. Veterinary medicine. I got to interview all these veterinarians. I didn't know, anything about that. I've published pieces on vaccines and learned all about them. And so it's been, a sort of wonderful opportunity to learn. I'm also the professor in a family medicine residency program. So I get to teach young doctors, and I run their integrative medicine curriculum and their community medicine curriculum. So I'm the part of their curriculum where they learn how to interface with other organizations and community members, and also teaching them really how to do a more holistic care and not just simply rely on pharmaceuticals and surgeries. And working with them, they're such a excited and exciting group of young people who are also very curious. And that's been a way of constantly infusing me and keeping me going. And so that is just a little bit of an insight into the career path. I actually got curious about curiosity as I was putting together this little talk. And I realized that it's actually been well studied. So you're probably going to see me publish an article about curiosity in a couple of weeks, but it has been well studied, and there's actually standardized questionnaires to look at it, because it's considered a positive trait generally, although parts of it can be dangerous, as we'll see. But a generally positive trait with really good outcomes in terms of interpersonal connections and also career success. And it's something that is something that you can cultivate. It's not something you're just born with. So I really, as folks view this talk and think about it, I really would love for you to think about building your curiosity muscle. And this is a 5-dimensional curiosity scale. I put the reference at the end, but it is the one that seems to be the most widely referenced. And I adapted it a little bit for this talk. But looking under subject areas like exploration, would you rate yourself 1 through 7 on I view challenging situations as an opportunity to grow and learn? 1 would be does not describe me at all. 7 completely describes me. I seek out situations where it is likely that I have to think in depth about something. I enjoy learning about subjects that are unfamiliar to me. I find it fascinating to learn new information. And then in terms of problem solving, thinking about, what did I just do? Thinking about solutions to difficult conceptual problems can keep me awake at night, which I definitely could give myself a 7 for. I can spend hours on a single problem because I can't rest without knowing the answer. And, actually, I want to say something, because I have lots of parents who come in and tell me they think their kid has attention deficit problems, into my medical practice. And, you see them and they're jumping around the room and they're describing a kid who can't focus on their studies. But I often ask these families, when it's something that interests them, can you not get them away from it? When you call their name, they won't even answer you. And a lot of times they say, oh, yes, absolutely. So I think a lot of times, there are folks who they just haven't found the right things that get them really curious. And that probably would have described me as a little kid too. I was bouncing off the walls. But when I got curious about something, I really, really focused. I feel frustrated if I can't figure out the solution to a problem, so I work even harder to solve it. And I think I can't, what was the last one? I couldn't see it because it's behind my little cursor here and I don't know.
I can say it says, I work relentlessly at problems that I feel must be solved.
Yeah, so it was a little bit the same as the next one. Uncertainty, and these are the smallest doubt can stop me from seeking out new experiences. So these are the negative. If you're answering yes to these, then it's sort of less curious. So I cannot handle the stress that comes from entering uncertain situations. I find it hard to explore new places when I lack confidence in my abilities. and it is difficult to concentrate when there is a possibility that I might be taken by surprise. So if you're answering this does describe me, then we want to move you down closer to the ones on those. And then thrill seeking, this is the area where curiosity sort of borders on a negative trait. Risk taking is exciting to me. When I have free time, I want to do things that are a little scary. Creating an adventure as I go is much more appealing than a planned adventure. And I prefer friends who are excitingly unpredictable. And I must say that I answer 7 to all of those too. So that's the negative side. And then social curiosity. I ask a lot of questions to figure out what interests other people. When talking to someone who is excited, I am curious to find out why. When talking to someone, I try to discover interesting details about them. And I like finding out why people behave the way they do. So you guys can take the curiosity test and see what you can do to sort of move yourself along for, or, for some of these things, and move yourself back maybe for others.
Well,
So,
that's great. I want to just jump in because we have something in Sonoma County called a Portrait of a Graduate. It was actually a community effort that we took, took about 6 months, and we did surveys with parents and students and teachers and educators, and to really try to identify the top attributes that we felt students need in order to sort of be successful in school and in life. And curiosity really was the top one. Like, so that was one of the top attributes that we all identified in Sonoma County as really, really important. And so I love that you're talking about that, because we really value that. I mean, in terms of, it seems like, I mean, as a community, we value that in our students, over necessarily some of those harder skills, or that is really something that is important for our kids.
wonderful. Well, I'm giving you my story of curiosity here.
Yeah. So there are some comments and questions that are coming in through Facebook. Somebody asked, have you ever found yourself lost or unfocused and thus paralyzed by the paths generated by your curiosity? And
All
how
the
do you push through that and build on your varied experiences to build your career?
yeah, all the time. And then, once I figure out the next step, then I pretend like, I'd always planned it that way. But
Fake it till you make it, huh?
yeah, uh, yes, I have. And, and I'd say that it's happened regularly, throughout my life. It doesn't, that piece doesn't necessarily get better. And so you have to, I think that does go back to the being able to sort of sit with the discomfort of unknowing. And I to speak to that same question, I also have sometimes suffered from not having the same kind of traditional role models or mentorship that folks who really do follow a prescribed path, or an established career do have. I mean, there have been moments where I've actually gotten negative feedback from mentors who I've very much admired because they didn't approve of the next step on my twisted, torturous path. I mean, my advisor in medical school, when she found out I was going into family medicine, because I went to a medical school that did not have um, a residency in family medicine, because they sort of looked at it as not academic enough. And she said to me, I really don't see you handing out throat lozenges for the rest of your life, because that was her view of family medicine. And obviously that was a horrible thing to say. But and at other times I just really haven't found an advisor, because finding someone who's interested in food systems and science writing but is also a doctor, those kinds of things can be hard. So but I've always found people who were doing things that were fascinating that made me curious, and I would learn from them, or at least take a piece from them and add it to the pile. But yes, there even recently, I made a recent decision pretty far on in my career to go back into teaching in academic medicine after being in science writing and doing more consulting and also clinical practice for years. I've always kept a clinical practice. I decided it was time for me to really start teaching the next generation. And so I took a job in this training program, but that's also required a whole new set of skills, even in administration and curriculum development and so on, that I've had to learn. So,
I have a question just for those that, like even me, and for younger folks who are interested in medicine, but what is family medicine? I mean, what's that versus what are the other routes that you could have gone?
oh, that's a wonderful question. So, family medicine is, in fact, the most popular specialty in the United States. We have more family doctors than any other kind of doctor. And my mentioning that about my medical school is probably particular to just a couple medical schools in the US that are kind of ridiculously snobby that way. Um, I what family medicine trains you to do is to focus on treating the whole family. So we say from cradle to grave, and so we take care of pregnant women, we take care of pediatrics, teens, adult medicine, geriatric medicine. We also learn how to do, procedures, generally fairly minor procedures, but some family doctors actually assist in operations. Some do deliveries. But what really distinguishes family medicine, regardless of what your focus is that family doctors are trained in a family systems model. So they really don't just think of patients as individuals. They think of them as connected to a family and how that might impact their health. And they also think of them as connected to a community. So thinking about what we call social determinants of health. So things like is there access to clean water and good food and clean air in the community, and what are the employment opportunities and so on. And when we're thinking about family dynamics, is this child's asthma due to smoking from someone else in the family, or are they living, near an agricultural field, like I mentioned? So really trying to think more through systems and not just in terms of that individual body.
Great. I have another question too around sort of like public health and community health. I think we all sort of took public health for granted until about a year ago. In some ways, a lot of us did. And, you know, I mean, what is your perspective of, in terms of like how we perceive public health or community health as a nation? You've traveled a lot of different places. And so how do you see the United States approaching that? And do you think anything will shift with this recent pandemic when it comes to community health?
That is also a wonderful question. And I think there are a couple states that have gotten it right with this pandemic. Alaska somehow is emerging as this incredible shining example. But yeah, we do. And, there's certainly cities that have gotten it right. And San Francisco is also really, and actually, I think Sonoma County is doing, you guys have had your schools open the whole time, haven't you?
No, we have not. No,
I thought that
unfortunately.
I thought it was one of the counties that had managed to do things a little differently, but um, the, uh, we have so much work to do in this country in terms of public health, and I think the problem is that it's been terribly underfunded, and you don't really understand how much you need public health until a crisis like this happens. So hopefully there's going to be a lot more people interested in careers, not just in zoonotics and, preventing the next pandemic, which we absolutely need people to do, but thinking a lot more about how, public health and community health impacts everything from, nutrition to opportunities for jobs and so on in the
Mhm.
air and environment and climate change. And yeah.
And for some of our younger audience, one of the questions, since you are now doing some teaching and guiding younger doctors, how does a young person be? We always talk about how you can be a good mentor, but how can a younger person be a good mentee? What do you see is important for them to bring to the table when it comes to getting guidance from people like you that have lots of experience?
Well, once again, going back to that concept of curiosity, I think that is super important. And someone who's just excited about what they're learning. I don't care what, somebody's interested in. I care that they're interested in something, and the amount of um, uh, enthusiasm that they bring to it, and also a willingness to really collaborate and work well with their peers, and obviously with folks who are mentoring them. But it's for me, it's so exciting when I see peer-to-peer collaboration and learning, and really willingness to lift each other up and work together. Um,
That's great. Let me just snoop around here, see if there's any other questions. I see Joe is still there, hanging in there. Joe, do you have any questions for us? Joe's on our Zoom. Let me snoop over to Facebook. Give it a sec. I got it. People on Facebook are a little behind, so. What was your aha moment? Like, did you always want to be a doctor, or, what kind of got you into that?
no, not at all. Actually studied anthropology in college. I was really, which kind of makes sense from the childhood I described. I was always interested in um, other cultures and cultures, subcultures within the US and so on. And I took a couple courses with someone who was just kind of world renowned in medical anthropology, and it got me fascinated, realizing that so many things that I had taken for granted in my head about health were actually very culturally bound, and that things that we think of as sort of given, might have a very different manifestation and explanation in other cultures. And as a result of that, I actually did an internship while I was in college with Save the Children, because I thought it was an opportunity. That it is a nonprofit organization, to go actually do storytelling for them and photography at some of their project sites around the world, basically for them to use for fundraising for their projects, because they're a non-governmental organization. And I was in Cameroon in West Africa because I was interested in photography and interested in writing. And I've always had this kind of art science thing going on. I was in Cameroon, and I started telling the stories of these traditional midwives that were working there, and just got fascinated, and got to attend a couple births, and kind of quit the job I was doing, and switched over and just started basically working with the midwives in Cameroon in West Africa. And that was the moment I realized that I really wanted to go to medical school, partly to get the skills. It seemed like such a fun thing. But also I realized that there was so many public health needs, and that having an MD might really help me be heard and get things done. I was working with a doctor, and saw how much attention he was able to get, and how much change he was able to make simply on the weight of his medical degree. And so that was part of it as well. But not at all necessary to get that degree for that work. But
You talked about some of the bumps you might have hit with some mentors, like those. I mean, were there other challenges that you faced, as you kind of went through this progression, or any, like, where you maybe regretted going one direction, and stepped back and had to shift gears again? Is there anything like that that you can share with our viewers in terms of, lessons learned?
yeah, so certainly, was, getting my pre-medical requirements done felt challenging, because I wasn't someone who actually had spent a lot of time studying STEM, and you have to do biochemistry and calculus and physics and all that. And it was another one of those moments where I realized I just had to show up and be curious and be good enough. And didn't have to be the best, and that there was sort of another goal in mind there. And I actually have used biochemistry a surprising amount in my work because I'm interested in nutrition, and I ended up loving it. But for a lot of doctors, they never use that stuff again. Um, and Actually, after my residency, well, a couple points. After my internship, I was married, and I decided I wanted to have kids. Had come to medical school a little bit late, and had my first child, my daughter, who is now 26. And that was, I stepped out of my career entirely for a year and a half, and then went back with only 1 year of training, residency, one out of 3 years of residency training under my belt, and worked as a general practitioner very part-time, and was a mom for a couple of years, and then had to go back into training with a young child. And that was an interesting challenge in realizing, that sort of how to be a parent, and also grow your career. And this is something for women that's so challenging. And once again, I sort of told myself that I had to be just good enough. There might be some imperfections on both sides in terms of the parenting side and the professional side. And obviously, you probably need to interview my daughter to get her part of the story. But then after my residency, I did a fellowship training at UCSF, and my plan then was to go into academic medicine and do exactly the kind of work that I'm doing right now, 25 years later. And I actually applied for a big grant from the National Institutes of Health. It was a $750,000 grant to do research. I was awarded it, and it was the first time that anybody had gotten that kind of grant. And the idea was really to become an academic. And I suddenly realized that I was following an advisor's dream at UCSF, and that it's not at all what I wanted to do, that I wanted to be, I wanted to write and be creative. And I also wanted to take care of patients in the community. And that it just wasn't me. And so I actually turned down this massive award and left UCSF. And that was a huge right turn in my career that, kept me up late at night wondering if I'd made the right decision for years. And looking back at it, it's the same thing where I now can say, oh, it's as if I had it all planned. And I'm
That's a
actually
very grateful way about it. I like that.
I'm back doing that kind of work now, but actually having had the opportunity to explore so many other things. And I feel like I finally now have I'm grounded enough and have enough of the wisdom to be teaching the next generation and asking meaningful research questions and so on.
Well, that's really great. I mean, we are the CTE Foundation, right? And so we really depend on our teachers to have that industry experience to bring to the classroom. And that's really important. Career technical education is all about that, is making sure that our teachers do have that industry work experience so that they can share what they know and their knowledge more than just the book stuff, but they can actually share their physical experience with that work.
Absolutely. And getting out there and having real life experiences and a variety of experiences is really important.
Well, thank you. It's been really cool to hear about your pathway and your bumps and your, sort of chutes and ladders, I guess, as you can say. I want to ask one last question, since you are health focused and food focused. What's for dinner?
I actually don't know, because haven't even gone downstairs to start to scavenge yet. But I actually have a nice little garden here, which I'm assuming that a lot of you being in Sonoma might have too. I live in Berkeley, but I tend to go out and grab something and chop it up and yeah, eat it with something else. I'm
Yeah.
kind of more of a forager than a fancy cook. So.
Nice. All right, good. Well, thank you for sharing. And I want to, invite you to, like learn more about CTE Foundation too. And we hope to have you back someday. I'm going to go ahead and actually share my screen just so people know what's coming up next. And again, I really appreciate you being here, Dr. Miller. And it was really fun to learn about your pathway. And thank you for sharing.
Thank you. And I want to wish all of the young women who you work with the best of luck in their careers.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye.